Everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks very much for joining our webinar today. We're going to be talking a little bit about AI and testing, specifically English testing. My name's Tom Williamson. I work with Skills for English at PSI on all things to do with university relationships and the recognition of Skills for English CELT qualifications for acceptance into higher education. I'm joined here by my lovely, delightful colleagues, Sean and Shakeh. Sean, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Gasperson. I'm the AVP of Assessment Services with PSI. I manage a wonderful group of psychometricians, test developers, and test development specialists in creating assessments for certification and licensure high-stakes examinations. I've been with PSI for roughly 3 years, but in high-stakes testing for about 15 years. So it's a pleasure to be with you all and look forward to the discussion.
And Shakeh?
Hi, everybody. I'm Director of Qualifications at PSI. I'm responsible for a suite of language tests and educational tests, which we develop and deliver. And in my team, I have test content developers, psychometricians, and people who are responsible for human scoring. Been with PSI since the year 2000, in language testing since 1999, in language teaching much earlier than that, a long time.
So basically, I've brought for you today two big brains and their teams of perhaps even bigger brains, maybe, or equally sized at least. So today, yes, we want to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. Now, this is a really hot topic in testing and in global business across the world and across all sorts of industries, all sorts of applications. I understand that artificial intelligence is both exciting and a tool for enhancing productivity, as well as sometimes alarming, maybe unsettling. And I think that what our ambition is to demonstrate what it's good for, what it can help with, but also what its limits are. To understand what those limits are, I think you have to understand where test development is now without AI and where it was before AI came into being. Perhaps Shakeh, I can start with you there. What was test development, test content creation, test generation like before these two letters were put together, A and I?
It's still much the same with AI, but it's a long and complicated process for us, especially in language testing. So we would always start with a review of our item bank and what we have. We would review how the previous test forms performed and collate all the learning that we've had from running the tests the previous year or the previous session. And we would establish what it is that we needed to contract item writers to develop this time around. And it might be full test content, it might be parts of test, it might be areas that we need more focus or a change of topic or a new approach. We would update all of our documents. That includes our guidance documents that we give to item writers, our checklists, any kind of processes that we have updated since the last round of commissioning. We would update all of those. We would find out the availability of our item writers, and we would contract them. So that would be all of the administrative stuff that happens at the beginning of every test cycle. For us, item writing always starts with the training of the item writers. They may be well-established writers. They may have written for us before, they may be brand new to writers, but we would always start with a round of training. If they're established, well, they'll be familiar with our approach, they'll be familiar with our guidance, but the guidance is always updated because every time an item writer asks a question, we'll learn something new that we can add to the guidance, something that can support their work. So we would run the training session where we look at the guidance, what's changed, we would look at the checklists and what's changed. We might give them sight of their previous items and how they performed at pre-testing, and it would be an opportunity for everybody to talk through what worked well last time, why the items performed the way they did, how they changed as they went through the process, and what we expect them to do this time. So they're fully prepared when they start our item writing. Because we're working in language testing, one of the first things we ask them to do when they start writing is to submit their ideas for topics and passages and the interaction for listening. That's because we don't want them to spend a lot of effort writing items for a passage that may not be suitable culturally for all of our students, or might be out of context or above level or below level. So that's their first submission. We ask them to submit their ideas, and we do an evaluation of their ideas. We might look at how those align with our needs, what we've asked them to do, and we give them feedback. And we might say, avoid this topic, we have lots on this topic. We might say, this isn't really suitable in our areas of the world, or we might say it's just not the kind of thing we're looking for. And we would suggest other things they can do. After that, they really start working on those passages and their items. And their first submission comes in with their adapted passages, all of the checklists completed. We ask them, for example, to predict how demanding they think the item will be, what CFR level they're targeting, and so on. We get all of the information about their source materials, copies of their source materials, any copyright information. So all of that comes in, and we do a thorough check of those. So what we want to do is ensure that they've met our specification, our blueprint, and any guidance that we've given them. We check that their CFR alignment is correct. We would check for cultural appropriacy. We would check for fairness and bias. We would check around the authenticity of the interaction. So if we're thinking about the listening, we would want the interaction between the speakers to be authentic. We would check whether they've provided sample answers and if the sample answers sort of align with the questions they're asking. And we would give them feedback on how well their submission fits our immediate requirement. And they go away and they work on that feedback. The second submission that comes in goes through a peer review. And we ask other item writers to look at each other's work and provide feedback. And that acts in two ways. Item writers know how to fix something. So if they find an issue, they can give their colleague advice on how to fix it. But also it's useful for item writers to see other people's work. It's a training activity for them. It opens up a little window of how other people work. So peer review happens, they give each other feedback. And at that point, we do our internal checks around plagiarism, around copyright, and we might do another check around accessibility. We might also check the accuracy of the content. So in a lot of cases in language testing, a particular text will be adapted. It might be a text around, I don't know, some new innovation. It might have an academic source, and item writers typically adapt texts for our CFR levels. And we would want to check that the content in those texts are accurate. So whether it's the reading, whether it's the writing or the listening, we would want to make sure that what's being communicated is factually accurate if they've adapted something. So those are the kinds of checks that we will do internally. And again, the item writer receives feedback. And they then submit their third draft, which is pretty good at that point because they've had a lot of feedback. And at that point, we bring them all together and run an editing meeting where item writers sit together and we all look at the same content and we go through it in great detail, line by line, word by word. We make sure that the vocabulary is appropriate to the level. We make sure that all of the items work in connection with each other. We make sure that the predicted answers are correct. We might have somebody from our examining team who would then think about how these items will work with our students who are writing responses because they'll have experience of student responses. Once that editing meeting is finished, essentially we have pretty good items. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. And we would then be thinking about the next stage, which would be recording. So we would create the tape scripts ready for the recording studio. We would proofread what we have. And if they haven't written directly in our item bank, which is one option, if they've written outside the item bank, then we would import those items into the item bank and do a check. So that's sort of the first content creation. Once those are ready, then we start thinking about pre-testing. Now, there are two options. We can pre-test separately, or we can include those pre-test items in our operational test forms. So if we're pre-testing the item separately, it's a little bit the same as creating our operational test forms. So we would create a pre-test form, which would go through a variety of checks. We would proofread it, obviously. We would check that our chosen items work well together. So if we had 3 passages, we would want to make sure that the experience for our pre-test test takers is a positive one. And we would then make sure everything is ready, and that would go out for pre-testing. If pre-test items are incorporated into test forms, then I'll come back to that. But essentially, we would create the operational test form and include pre-test items. And that would be part of the design of the test, that pre-test items have to be included into operational test forms. And similar checks will go ahead. But because it's an operational test form, so for our test takers, it's their real test plus some extra items, we do far more checks. with the operational test forms, we would be looking at appropriacy, cultural appropriacy. We would be looking at a combination of tests together. We would have an external reviewer as well as internal reviewers. So we would have people externally who are specifically trained to look at fairness issues and bias and cultural appropriacy. Internally, we would look again at accuracy of the content and the appropriacy of the interaction. We would get somebody to work through the test as a test taker would, somebody who's had no input to the test before, and they would give us their feedback. So the item that first the item writer submits to us is very different from the item that goes into a pre-test or an operational test form. Once those are back, then the item goes through a second round of review, because now we have data alongside our professional judgment of how the item works. We have test data, and we know how test takers have performed. And we use that test data in a variety of ways. We might choose to reject an item because it just hasn't performed as we expected. It's just not appropriate. We might choose to revise an item because we can see that it didn't perform as we expected, but we can see how we can fix it. And if we do that, then it's pre-tested again. Or we might think that it worked really well and it goes into the item bank for a future test form. There are other things we do as well that has an impact. We would do standard setting, whether that's a modified Angoff or whether that's equating using statistical data. That might throw up some issues that we haven't thought about. If it's a modified Angoff and we have specialists in the room, then they might have opinions about how the items have worked. And so the important thing is to review the items regularly with a clear purpose. So at each stage of the review, you know what you're looking for. You're focusing your subject matter experts' attention on the thing that you want them to look at. You're collating all that information and you're documenting all that information so that if you're ever challenged or if there's a question, you know why you made the decisions that you made. And the underlying driver is not whether the item generated by the item writer is good. It's whether the item that the test taker sees is as good as you can possibly make it, and you can prove why it is the way it is. You have all of the checklists, the processes, the systems, the trackers that tell people this is how the item was improved, and this is why we think it's now a good item to present to a test taker. That's the driving consideration for us.
Thanks, Shakeh. That's really detailed, and I think that people really get a sense of both the science and the art of refining an item. I think that really comes across. I was quite interested in how there are various aspects of that university staff members in particular will be quite interested in. For example, in how you might align an item to the CFR, what that process of alignment actually entails. I think the CFR is quite a detailed document that lots of university admissions people are quite proficient in or would like themselves to be proficient in. And I think that process would really illustrate how to be proficient in the CFR. So I would like to say at this point, if anybody has any questions, such as, for example, that prompt that I've just given, you are welcome to put in the question function in GoToWebinar at any time during this, and we can address them in the last 15 minutes of this call. So yeah, thanks, Shakeh. Sean, I want to move on to you now. I want to think more about this big, behemoth concept, AI, and I think that it's been around for a lot longer than ChatGPT, right? And so I want to know a bit more about what PSI's history has been like with AI in general as a company.
Great question. And, I think as we hear Shakeh kind of go through the process, it's pretty clear that it's a very intensive process, rigorous process that requires the input of experts at every step. And, as we've kind of understood the capabilities of what AI can offer, the real benefit of AI is not to replace people, but to make them exponentially more efficient with the time that they have. We work with, across various industries, we work with subject matter experts who sometimes volunteer their time. They have, they have families, they have jobs, and they commit their time to creating these high stakes assessments that are critical to their field. And
just some examples, what fields could they be for people who are only aware about English testing?
Sure. Healthcare, information technology, certification, like, any sort of field that requires an assessment as sort of a final hurdle to verify your competence and readiness to practice safely and competently. And that it's a very intensive process to ensure that it's a valid and reliable assessment, because we administer these assessments, we develop them, design them so that we can make certain inferences about people. And the art and science that you mentioned is so critical in that process, because we want to ensure that the content of the assessment directly measures that knowledge, those skills, so that when they're ready to practice in their field, we can ensure that all stakeholders, the public, can be confident in that they have achieved at least a minimal acceptable level of competence within their field, within their industry. And coming back to AI, it's our approach has been a disciplined and intentional approach to ensure that we implement AI responsibly. That's kind of the key consideration, is not just to have a solution, but to have a solution that can be implemented securely and responsibly, because those are the types of questions that we get from our stakeholders. Clearly, this is a powerful technology, a powerful tool, but there are many considerations that have to go into that implementation. It's not a solution in search of a problem. We kind of identify the various pieces in the assessment development process. As you just heard, there's many points of input by people, and content creation is a big component of that. But as you work in this process to develop an assessment, there are many opportunities that are sort of operational inefficiencies, right? There's just some very minor things, across the whole spectrum of assessment development that provide opportunities for AI to empower people to be more efficient with their time. And that's kind of our approach, is that we design this system, this capability, with subject matter experts in mind, not to replace them, because their key expertise is always important. But it's how can we empower them to be more efficient? How can we take the precious time that they do have, that they commit graciously to these important projects, and enable them to be efficient, to be to make their jobs easier, basically. So it's identifying these points throughout the process, and PSI's kind of journey kind of goes back a few years to we have deep roots in test prep. So preparing candidates on their journey to take an assessment. There's practice exams that have been around for a long time, but I think that we wanted to design a system and a capability that provides test takers with an opportunity to learn, to interact with the resources that they use to study, to provide a more formative experience, so a learning focused experience that's interactive, that's easy to use, that enables their test readiness when they're ready to sit and take a high stakes assessment. So that's kind of our approach, and we've worked with our test takers and subject matter experts to continuously refine and listen to the test takers with what they want out of that system, which is an interactive learning experience, user-friendly interface, and the capability to kind of talk to the resources, to go through a self-study experience that's customized to them, to their preparation, to focus on the areas of need for that specific test taker. And AI really has an immense capability to enable that.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, one thing that you touched on that I found really interesting and important is the relationship between, let's say, an organization trying to build in more efficiency with AI for a particular test or a particular product, and the people whose expertise make those tests possible in the first place. And it's nice and quite reassuring to hear that it's about efficiency and not replacement. I think that's really important for people to understand that tests aren't going to be made by AI. The expert's going to make tests using AI, right? I think that's the idea. Shakeh, I want to ask you how exactly you would suggest experts using AI to make tests can be bettered by AI to make those tests. Well, what is it that the contribution? What is the contribution that AI makes to making an expert do their job better?
Well, from an efficiency perspective, as Sean was saying, AI can generate content very quickly. If it's been trained properly, then it can generate content very quickly. Whereas item writers, we typically give them 6 to 8 weeks to come up with the ideas, to do the writing, to do the development, to do the thinking, to fill in the checklists and submit it to us. So AI can do that much more quickly. It's true. But we also need to bear in mind that AI needs to be trained before we can push the button, before it can generate content. And for that training, we need our subject matter experts to provide the input. And we need them to review the first few rounds of generation until we know that the prompts are correct and the AI is working the way we want them to work. So that kind of quality assurance and training hasn't changed. We need our subject matter experts. And once the content is generated, it still needs to go through all of the QA activities that we have now. There's an assumption that somehow AI will be magically good or magically bad, or that item writers are magically good. But in fact, item writing is quite a complex process, especially when you're writing for language testing, because there isn't a body of knowledge we're testing. We're testing the outcome of that knowledge as test takers use it to communicate. And so item writers are not necessarily born, they're made. It takes years of experience. And even as an experienced item writer, I know I'll come across something at Teacher Commission where I'll think, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That was a clever way of doing that, or saying that, or wording that particular question. So there's always learning to be had. But either way, we need to ensure that the item that the test taker sees is as good as we can make it. And that means checking for accuracy, that means checking for appropriacy, that means checking for fairness. None of those things have changed, and neither has the reliance on external standards like the CFR and our own internal standards for quality assuring items. So whether it's generated by AI or by humans, the checking and quality assurance stays the same. If anything, with AI, because we need to ensure that our stakeholders have a buy-in and that our item writers as SMEs feel confident, and our users, not just our test takers, but the universities and the receiving institution, have faith in our test, we need to make sure that we evidence all of the checks that we do, whether it's AI or human generated. So for me, it's the quality assurance that matters, not how they started their life.
Yeah, I find that interesting. I think what you're assuring the quality of is the AI's capacity to distinguish between a test taker's competence, which you can't test, and the performance, which is the only thing you can test, right? And as a human, the art is to be able to write an item that lets you infer to the competence through their performance as seamlessly as possible. And I think the thing that one has to be careful with AI is believing that it is sort of this all-powerful, omniscient sort of object that knows everything about everyone, and it's going to write the perfect item, right? That's kind of what you're saying.
That's right. It's a tool. It's a tool. It brings to mind, sorry, Sean, it brings to mind when we first introduced online marking in the UK in 2004 and 2005. And immediately the worry was that all these examiners would lose their work, because we had introduced, rather than receiving packets of test taker scripts at home, we were scoring on screen online. And it didn't remove the need for human intervention and human scoring. All it did was remove the burden of receiving packages through the post of test taker responses. It avoided losing test taker responses in the post, and it avoided the need to take those packages back to the post office and send them back to the awarding organization. So it provided an efficiency without removing the need for human intervention for accurate scoring. And this is going to be the same. It'll provide us with some efficiencies, but it won't remove human intervention and human quality assurance.
I think that's a really clear and obvious lesson learned from the rollout of this technology. And as you mentioned, is that it doesn't necessarily mean the apocalypse has come, that a new technology has arrived, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that technology is going to be perfect and revolutionize everything overnight. Sean, I want to ask, what other kinds of lessons have PSI have you learned from rolling AI out across all of our programs? You mentioned, I think PSI runs something like 22 million tests a year across all of its various kinds of programs. So everything from, allowing firemen to go and fight fires, to allowing real estate agents to go and sell homes, right? All of these sorts of tests that we run. what lessons have you learned from rolling out AI?
You know, I think that when implemented securely and responsibly, AI has the immense capability to change, you know, some of the foundational attributes of the exam development cycle. You know, it doesn't drastically shift, but it modifies that process in such a way that people are enabled. I think that there's also been a shift of acceptance with stakeholders and the assessment industry in general. You know, the past 3 years ago, when we talked about AI, the question was, is it appropriate to use this technology at all? And now, you know, a few years later, it's accepted as a technology and a capability that's here to stay. And the question is now, when you decide to use AI, how can you use it responsibly and securely? So it's kind of a shift in recognition from the stakeholders that this is an immensely game-changing technology, and it really has the power to kind of enable people. So I think that there's been a high degree of acceptance over the past couple of years. Some lessons learned is that it's important when you're implementing this capability, as Shakeh kind of alluded to, that it's a disciplined approach in creating the system architecture pays significant efficiency dividends later in the process. So creating the system guardrails, creating kind of the rules and refining the content early on, establishing what reference material is appropriate, establishing what item writing guidelines are, so that when we create items at scale later down in the process, that those items have been will now adhere to the guidelines that we've established early on. So it's leveraging the expertise of people to create that kind of system architecture, the rules, the guidelines, the guardrails, so that later on when we generate content at scale, the role of people becomes more efficient, because the review process of the content that's generated significantly decreases because we've put in so much effort initially to construct that system and architect that system to create high quality content.
Yeah, interesting. And I think one thing I think that people are particularly kind of enlivened by with specifically generative AI and test development is what you've talked about there, which is the generation of content, right? You know, we interact with, you know, your favorite LLM, and, you know, I'm not going to advertise any specific ones here. And you see it, you know, generate text that seems like there's a human behind your screen. So, you know, perfect, exactly understanding what you want as much as it can. You know, not perfect in some cases, of course. But AI can do a lot more, isn't that right, Shakeh? There's more to aiding test development with AI than just generating content. And I think that's one of the things that really helps to define PSI's approach, right? You know, how is PSI using AI to go from test content generation to something more like maybe, I don't know, test management?
Well, immediately it removes some of the manual checks that we do. So currently with human writers, we expect them to submit their original sources. So if they've written a passage around, I don't know, SUVs or satellite engineering or whatever it might be, we expect them to submit their original sources. And we spend a lot of time then manually checking what they've adapted as the passage for the test taker against the original. I even remember in a past life going around the awarding body trying to find somebody who was a physics specialist, because we had an item writer who'd submitted a passage around a physics experiment. And I just wanted to make sure that the content was accurate, that we wouldn't have somebody with knowledge of that particular experiment commenting on its accuracy. One of the things AI can do is do that kind of check for accuracy for us and remove the manual process of having to find the sources, read the sources, and do that check for accuracy. It can give us a measure of the accuracy of the content that an item writer has submitted, just as it can do the same for itself. If it does propose a passage, we can ask it to give us a measure of the accuracy of the content of that passage. It can help us manage our item banks better, because it can tell us whether we have duplicate items or duplicate topics in the item bank. And that's useful information if you're looking at the content of your item bank and planning for the future. It's useful to know what you have that is on the same topic. And it's not always easy, because item writers will give their passages different topics. We might have entered them over time into the bank with different parameters. As time changes, our parameters change and get refined. So it's a useful tool. Besides just generating content for us, it can help us remove some of those administrative tasks, so that when we approach an item writer, because we've got a series of items that need revision, they can just focus on what they do best, which is look at those items and propose changes to those items to make them more focused, more appropriate, more in line with our needs.
I think there's also something interesting as well about being able to identify levels of difficulty and think about copyright issues as well. Is that possible with generative AI, Shakeh?
Yes, it can do. It can give us a measure around the cognitive load. It can give us a measure around the level of vocabulary used in the text. It can give us a value around the difficulty of the passage. So it can give us other measures. It's all a question of what we ask it to do and what we teach it to do. So it can provide some of those measures that helps us remove the manual checking of the vocabulary against a word list, for example. We haven't used it to align passages to the CFR statements. As you said, there are lots of CFR statements, and some of them are very precise, some of them are quite vague. And at the moment, we'll reach out to multiple SMEs, subject matter experts, to help us ensure that an item is aligned where we want it to be with the CFR. And so by collecting lots of opinions around the appropriacy of an item in relation to the CFR levels, we ensure that we're right. We have the internal expertise and we have our external experts. AI could do that for us. We wouldn't necessarily just go with it, but it removes some of that need. It would give us an indication that we can then work on.
Interesting. I think it's also nice to hear that there is a limit that you think that AI has as well. The limit being perhaps, being able to navigate the vagueness or ambiguity of different CFR statements, for example. Do you have any other ideas in mind about what limits could be, or would you like to comment on that as well?
Well, it's always evolving, isn't it? It's always changing. That's the thing. What it does today will be different from what it could do yesterday. But I think we should just view it as a tool that's useful. It's useful for us, and it means that as an agency, we can better use the SMEs that we have and make better use of their expertise, rather than sending out a whole load of printouts from our item bank and asking them to find duplicates. But I think, Sean, in your area, you may have worked in other subject areas where establishing the cognitive demand of a test is going to be different.
Yeah, it all kind of goes back to, how do you construct the system? What rules do you implement in place? And part of that is defining the cognitive levels. What is a cognitive level? What are some examples of items at various cognitive levels, so that the system can understand, okay, if we want this cognitive level, when it is time to generate content, what are the rules that it must adhere to? And how can we map that back onto the cognitive level that we've established in the system architecture initially? Because it's much easier to establish that rules for content at scale later than it is to review, let's say, 1,000 items that have been generated without those instructions, and then assign and edit and decide what the cognitive level is. It really just pays off efficiency dividends to have a disciplined approach to designing that system architecture. That could be cognitive levels. It could be what are examples of items that may display bias, right? So it's everything that we would implement in training a person to train that system in the same way.
Interesting.
And SMEs can be involved in that. We draw on our SME. It's not just internal expertise that we apply when we're training the system. We draw on our external SMEs, our item writers and reviewers and so on, to help us make sure that the system knows what it needs to do for us.
And I'd like to dig into this concept of difficulty a bit more as well, if you could, Sean, in your reply. Like, well, what does it mean for some passage, say, some item, to be more or less cognitively difficult? Sean, what that's you.
Yeah, it's a variety of factors. I think it's is it just a simple kind of recall of knowledge from text? Is it does successful performance on that question require an analysis of interdependencies within that question? Does it require one to apply knowledge to a certain situation that we may present them with? So it's kind of varying levels of needing to apply your knowledge within a particular situation that may or may not exist across different questions. There's certainly always a place for recall, simple recall questions. But when we're talking about preparing someone to practice in their industry, it is advantageous to have the content of that assessment to represent what that practice looks like. So it's not just memorizing definitions or formula within a textbook, but it's how would I take that and apply that in a practical situation. That is often a better prep and a better evaluative tool for people who are preparing to practice in the public and in their industry.
Shakeh,
I can add to that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Absolutely. We want to ask questions in language testing that give us an indication of what the test taker can do with the language that they have in order to communicate successfully. In terms of the passages we develop, it's that balance between the complexity of the content versus the complexity of the language. We can have a very complex concept being communicated in very simple language, or we can have a very simple concept communicated in a very complex language. And that the use of those, the balance between complexity of content versus the language, is what defines and helps us establish alongside the CFR levels. And what we want is to develop questions that show us how the test taker interacts with the passage that they're reading or the recording that they've heard, in terms of can they follow the concepts, can they follow the argument, can they follow the opinions that the speakers are giving. How are they interacting with the passage and the language within the passage? And so devising those questions alongside the passage is really key. I know there are item writers who might start with a question and write the passage, or write the passage, find the passage and write it and write the questions, or do both at the same time, two screens at the same time. But it's that interaction between the test taker, the question they're reading, and the passage they're in front of them that adds to the level of demand. We can make it more or less difficult for the test taker to achieve the score, the mark, by playing around with the complexity of the passage versus the complexity of the question. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, how does the test taker come to the answer that they give? What are the thinking processes that they have to undergo in order to circle the letter A or to write a paragraph or a sentence in response? And that's the key to the interaction between passage and question.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to move our focus ever so slightly before we go on to questions, in part because I've seen a question that actually relates to a topic that we've not yet covered. So I'm going to start with my question to you guys, then I'll follow on with the question from the audience. So as many of our audience members will be aware, PSI is considered in international testing circles to be a global leader in security. Such is that expertise that we recently released a product called Test Security as a Service. We've had so much demand for our operating procedures and policies and software and practices that many of our clients and many of our competitors, kind of want to buy our expertise off us. A part of that expertise with relation to security concerns AI. And what I would like to ask you, Sean, is how does AI enhance PSI's ability to deliver and generate and manage tests and their content securely?
It's a great question. And, PSI's approach to test security is a holistic one, right? So it doesn't just have to do with the test administration and analyzing data after the administration, but there's definitely a preventative aspect to this too that is directly tied to test development, right? So when we talk about that, we mean AI allows us the capability to generate a lot of content quickly. And when we talk about test security, One of the potential issues is, the stealing of content or, compromised content with bad actors, and having a robust item bank effectively kind of minimizes the effect of those incidents that may occur, right? So if we think about 100 items that have been potentially compromised, what is our course of action with ensuring that test takers after that incident receive a high quality and fair examination, that we can still make those inferences about them appropriately? And having a robust item bank is certainly a huge tool in preventative test security, because it allows us flexibility in the content that we administer and the forms that we create, et cetera. There's also a big component to within the delivery and analyzing data after delivery. So it's establishing rules for data analysis for patterns that may indicate bad actors, right? So there's a huge component of post administration analysis and security at the test centers that really has the immense capability that AI could offer that way. So it's not one aspect alone, but it's kind of a holistic view of test security, and how can many different teams within PSI have a direct impact on the quality of the test security, that we can ensure our partners that their assessments are kept secure, and that their test takers have that level of competence, and they can have confidence in their abilities once they go through that assessment.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to ask the question that I just referred to in relation to this point. It's more holistic, so I'll let either of you jump in on it as to whatever you think your areas of expertise relate to it. But I think it's touching on how successful we have been with integrating AI over the course of its history of existence, not just in the last couple of years with ChatGPT or Gemini or any other model that you would like to choose. What are the most important things to consider for an organization that wants to utilize AI?
I would start with establishing a policy for use within the organization. That's kind of where I would start. Understand what types of things are acceptable, what are not acceptable, and having your organization aligned to those standards and principles for the policy that you establish. I think that right-sizing the solution for what AI can offer to tailor to the needs of your organization. When implementing an AI solution, is not always cheap. It can be a significant time and resource investment to have a right-sized solution for your organization. So I would say identify the opportunities that AI can offer, understanding that the purpose is to make people more efficient. So what does that look like in your organization? If it's assessment development, how can we ensure that it's implemented securely and responsibly? And kind of just understanding the specific needs of your organization and where AI can fit within those pieces. I think that is kind of an effective use and an effective approach, is to just understand where is it possible, where does it make sense for us to use this technology, and how can we implement that securely and responsibly.
Shakeh, would you have anything to add?
No, I agree with Sean's message there. I think what's also important as you begin using AI is to make sure that you document your processes, document your approaches, document what the outcome was, because you start small and you start experimenting. And if you want to make sure that as you're playing with it, as you're trying it out, that there is learning taking place, then it's important to document all of the stages of that. And that helps you to put, when you get to the point where you are generating content, for example, that you can use the learning from earlier stages to put in a process that's sound and defensible, a process that you could make public, because what you're saying to people is, yes, we're using AI, but look how, and here is the document to support that. This is how we're making our judgments. So documenting things as you go is really useful, because when you get to the point where you're truly using AI, then you have everything in place to make sure you can provide that level of confidence to your stakeholders, whoever they may be.
Well, speaking of confidence and defensibility and so on, we have another question here, which seems to be following on from the prompt that I gave so early on in the webinar about alignment with the CFR. The question is touching on basically how do you justify an alignment with the CFR? The question is how can you defend mapping a test item to the CFR? Yeah, it's about that sort of, what is it within the CFR, and what is it about an item that allows you to say, yeah, here's the link?
It's very difficult without looking at specific items and thinking about specific skills. For us, it starts with the designing of the test. So when we're designing a brand new test, we have a clear purpose. We have a good understanding of the test taker community, and we have a good understanding of the test user community and their needs. And that's when we bring in the CFR and say, given these circumstances, the purpose, the test user, the test taker, what level of CFR are we going to develop our tests at? At what level of CFR are we going to develop tests? So if it's at a particular level, for example, that already narrows down the number of statements you're looking at. If it's for a particular skill, that narrows the number of statements you're looking at even further. And so it starts at the design stage. The CFR are vague, and for us, ensuring that an item is aligned with this CFR means bringing in multiple opinions. There is no one magic way of doing it, but if you're bringing in enough opinions, starting with the item writer and the reviewer, the external reviewers who look at the whole test, the internal expertise, if you have a group of SMEs and experts who agree, then you're probably there. And your pre-testing and item analysis and alignment with other items that have worked well help you establish that an item is at the level you want it to be at. So it's that combination of professional judgment as well as the outcome of testing and equating that you do that makes you feel more confident that a test is at a particular level. As teachers, we've all worked with course books that claim to be at B1 or C1 or whichever one of the CFR levels they're aiming at. And again, writers of those course books will have their professional judgment in play. The course books may have gone out to SMEs to make judgments on as well. And so that's another source of information, as is other tests that are familiar and well established. But essentially what you're doing is collecting as much professional judgment as you can from people that you've trained and are experts, and aligning that with the psychometric evaluations that you've got in relation to other items or other tests that you've delivered. And that gives you confidence that you are assessing at the right CFR level. I don't know, Sean, if there's anything else.
Well, I wanted to I think that what came through with your response, Shakeh, is that there's still a heavy reliance on the expert judgment of people. AI does not change that. We would never kind of generate an item and then just include it on a test. There's no item that's generated that isn't first reviewed and approved and edited as necessary before it's considered to be eligible for testing, right? So the role of human verification, keeping humans and experts in the loop, that will always be a critical component of the process, regardless of whether we use AI or not.
Nice, fantastic. I think that's a well-rounded response. There's a question here that relates to a topic on my list of notes that I didn't manage to get to, which concerns the way that people have reacted to AI being introduced in testing in recent years. The question is about staff, but my question was about clients. Maybe, Sean, I can ask you to react to both of those. So how staff internally within PSI reacted to AI, and I guess now more specifically, the reaction being most pertinently relevant to generative large language models, and how have clients reacted to this in terms of what they want from us? The California Real Estate Board or something. I've made that up. That's not. I don't know if that's necessarily a client, but as an example for people who are in the English language testing industry.
There's been, like I said, there's been kind of a shift in the perception of this capability within the assessment industry. Now I think that there's a high degree of excitement about the possibilities that this can offer to generate, evaluate, and manage content. And I think that a key component of that is being prepared to answer the questions that will inevitably come from your stakeholders. Most of that is related to security and quality. And our stakeholders want to be sure that their content that they've invested years and years of resources into remains secure within our closed system. And that's how we've constructed our capability to be able to answer those questions, to make sure that there's no data shared across different assessments, that no models being trained using client data, for example. And as long as we can, have good answers to those questions about the way in which we're using AI responsibly, that's kind of the key transparent stakeholder message, is having those answers to those questions. And then, ensuring that the content that is produced is of high quality. And how do we construct and architect our system to ensure that? At the end of the day, if you have 1,000 poor items, it doesn't really do you any good. We have to make sure that we're not just generating content, but we're generating high quality content so that we can see the benefits of that efficiency that we've gained. And that goes into, human evaluation, pre-testing, to ensure that regardless of the source of an item, whether that's human or AI generated, when it's time to consider that to be included in an assessment that evaluates someone's competence, that it still performs at an acceptable level, that it still meets the psychometric criteria that we've established for our assessments, and that it's not just generating content, but it's of high quality that we can have trust in, that will be a benefit to our testing programs.
Nice. Anything to add, Shakeh?
Yes.
Absolutely. Saw in your eyes.
Yeah,
You're like,
I was just thinking about our personal experience of working with AI in my team. It's one thing asking AI to find the best route to your destination or the best insurance policy for your car. It's something very different working with it in your own work environment. And one of the things that is done in my team is make us go back and review our standards, our documents, our blueprints, because we are training this system to produce the kinds of items we want. It's making us look at things that we might have taken for granted. CFR is one of those things that I don't know how many of our listeners actually go and look at the CFR statements on a regular basis. We do each time we commission, because we're evaluating our item writer's output. But it's made us revisit our documentation in a different way, to revisit our standards in a different way, to revisit our blueprints in a different way, and look at those documents and think about how we communicate the information in those documents, because we're trying to communicate with a system, with a machine. And so that's been really useful. That's been quite exciting, sitting down and looking at what our standards mean, how we apply them, and how can we teach this tool to apply them in a similar way. And can we word them differently? Can we explain it better? That's been really exciting.
Well, that kind of touches on the point I made at the start, which is AI is both exciting and sometimes a little bit alarming. I think that's a nice concept to hear, that it's also quite exciting. I have one last question, which is 3 words, but I'm hoping it will relate to a topic that I think, Sean, you touched upon, test prep help. You mentioned at some point that the use of AI in PSI has had a long history with helping test takers prepare. I think that lots of our audience members are going to be really interested in helping people prepare for their English proficiency tests, because that's a lot of the role of, say, an international student recruitment partner, is to be able to facilitate their students to prepare as best they possibly can. I can open this up to both of you, though. I think, how can AI help the development of test preparation materials? Because I think not only just about generating content, right, but also about sort of individualization and customization. Is that true?
Absolutely. I think that the possibilities that it offers is a customized, interactive, formative experience to prepare you for test day, but also beyond test day, make you a more knowledgeable and capable practitioner. And there's there's lots of different data points as you go through a practice assessment, such as evaluating your confidence in your knowledge of that question, your speed that you go through, the number of times that you switch answers as you go through, and all of that are different data points that can be very quickly analyzed using AI to understand yourself as you're preparing to take a test. What are my habits? What areas do I feel confident in? How can I generate a custom study session with the resources based on my performance of this assessment? So the capabilities are a customized experience to that individual test taker who's preparing for test day. And the capability of that is that it's done very quickly and efficiently, right? So that was always possible, but I think the time that it takes after that test preparation experience to understanding those data is significantly reduced. So it's instantaneous now because it learns as you go through the assessment, and it provides feedback to you on strengths and weaknesses, test taking behavior, to help you kind of understand where you need to focus your test preparation to get ready for that high stakes assessment.
And it can link that to learning, can't it? Because it can identify an area that you are weak at, and it can then direct you to learning that will focus on that specific point. It can identify that you have an issue with the use of tenses, and then it can provide you with training that focuses on that particular area of grammar or vocabulary or whatever it may be, so that you don't have to do that link yourself. It can very smoothly look at your behavior and your performance and then suggest solutions that can help you improve whatever it is that you need to improve.
Nice one. Well, on such a positive note of improving with AI, I think I would like to wrap up our webinar and draw this to a conclusion. I would like to thank everybody very much for being here and listening. I hope that we've answered all your questions and that we've been sufficiently interesting, engaging, and entertaining, or at the very least interesting. I guess that would be the minimum viable product of a webinar. I would like to promote our attendance at a big conference happening in central London in about a few weeks' time. It's the UK ENIC 2025 conference. It's going to be a big event specifically for those who work in UK universities in admissions departments. This is a fantastic conference for you. If you've not heard of it, I would recommend you get your boss's approval to go, or if you are the boss, then you should be going. I would love to see you there. We have a gold sponsorship, so we have a stand, I think, in position 6 or 7. You'll see us just as you're walking through up the stairs. And we have a couple of sessions going on during that event. We have a talk from Charlie Wall, who was in the previous webinar, and Isabel Gontier, who is the head of assessment here. We have a panel where we're going to be talking more about AI in the future of testing. And we're also on the English language panel, which I've been assured by the ECTIS, the UK ENIC staff, is always the best attended and most interesting panel of the entire 2-day conference. So if you'd like to come and see us at any point over those 2 days, the 1st and 2nd of December in the Queen Elizabeth II Centre opposite the Houses of Parliament in London, I would be delighted to see you there. And I, again, thank you very much for coming, and leave Shakeh and Sean to say thank you and goodbye as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.